The connection between language and thought is profound. The majority of our everyday life involves the use of language. We share our ideas with others using language. We read their responses and understand their meanings with language, and very often we even speak internally to ourselves when we process information and make logical conclusions. This overlapping between language and thought seems to happen all the time, to the extent that some linguists like Sapir and Whorf proposed that thought is completely determined by language, while on the contrary, others think that the two are separate and independent entities. A structure of language cannot determine how a person thinks. Therefore, they claim that thought were prior than language. However, some linguists still disagree with either theory. Thus, a third theory was postulated claiming that language and thought are interdependent. They think that language is a regular part of the process we call thinking, and that there is no notion that precedes the other, they are both essential. The idea of thought being shaped by language was at first considered irrational and untestable. However, a new branch of cognitive scientific research made us wonder, is it the case that our thoughts depend on the language we speak? For example, consider a person who has already walked in the park. In English, we must choose the verb tense and say walked rather than walk to indicate timing. But in Indonesian, we can change the verb's tense. In Arabic and Russian, the verb we'd use would reveal the gender of the person making the action. In other words, it would be different if that person is a woman or a man. Another example is that some words like uncle or aunt in languages such as Arabic and Mandarin would need specification on whether they are from my mother's side or from my father's. How the structure of a language affects its speaker is evident in the German language. People whose languages are systematically organized, such as the German language, tend to think more systematically and with more organized thoughts. And perhaps this is the reason why Germany had a history of brilliant mathematicians and scientists. Perhaps the organized structure of a language helps the person indeed to have an ordered logic of thought. Nevertheless, language can do quite the opposite. An example for that is the Piraha tribe, an Amazonian tribe which has no concept of numbers in their language. Studies showed how this lack of language resulted in a lack of development of mathematical concepts. This means that people cannot develop thoughts they do not have words for in their language. George Orwell adopted this idea in his famous book in 1984, where the government manipulated the language of the country by removing any vocabulary about rebellion or freedom. People couldn't express their own depressed emotions, and so the government had them under its control. The idea that language and thought are intertwined is indeed an ancient topic. Many philosophers weighed in against such relation. Plato, being one of the earliest known philosophers, argued that all concepts exist as eternal ideas, namely forms. These forms existed independent of what language one is speaking. Language should, at best, aim at reflecting these ideas as accurately as possible. A similar view was adopted by St. Augustine, another philosopher arguing that language was merely labels applied to already existing concepts. Roger Bacon, an English philosopher, argued that language was but a veil covering up eternal truths, hiding them from human experience. For Immanuel Kant, one of the greatest philosophers of all time, language was but a tool, like many other, used by humans to experience the world. As it appears, the ruse against the entanglement of language and thought lies in the philosophy of the problem. To truly test such principle, one needs to answer questions that had puzzled philosophers since the beginning of time. What is the nature of reality, and how do things exist? Once these questions are answered, one will be fully able to classify thought and language and see where they overlap, if they even do. Finally, the complexity of the relationship between language and thought seems to be a buzzing problem. The studies discussed indicate a dependence of thought on language. The reason for such dependence is yet to be known and remains as mystery. It is worthy to emphasize that all humans should perceive the same world irrespective of their own native language. And in the light of the argument that thought can only be understood in language terms, a question shall arise, and that is, in what language did man think of inventing a language? Inventing a language was indeed a thought process, and so how did man conceive of such a process without language? These questions and many others remain unanswered in such branch of philosophy of language. However, their answers would solve some of the major problems of philosophy, due to the direct relationship with the nature of reality and metaphysics, and because of its direct linkage with epistemology and the philosophy of mind and the origin of thoughts. Such questions hold an extremely important place in philosophy and should undoubtedly attract seekers of truth, those who are thrilled by the search in the deep fields of the unknown to extract the greatest glory of the human knowledge.